Chapter 7. Doubting Castle. Hopeful, an inhabitant of Vanity Fair, had decided to accompany Christian on his pilgrimage, and so the two men escaped from the town, hurried away together. Before long they overtook a man who, though secretive about his name, told them that he came from the town of Fair Speech, and would like to travel with them to the celestial city. "Is this town of Fair Speech a prosperous place?" asked Christian. "Indeed it is, and I have many titled relatives there," the stranger replied. "We are good religious folk, though not as strict as some. We favour moderation and flexibility." These words gave Christian a clue as to the identity of their new companion, and he asked him, "Are you called Bunyan?" "That is the nickname given to me by my enemies, simply because I am flexible and progressive," was the reluctant reply. "If you want to travel with us, you must be prepared to go against the wind and tide and be true to your faith, whether it brings you riches or poverty, popularity or persecution," Christian told the speaker firmly. Bunyan was not prepared to agree to this. "You must not impose your ideas on me," he protested. "Allow me my freedom and let me go with you." But Christian refused to retract his conditions, and so Bunyan parted from them with the words, "I will never betray my harmless and profitable principles. So since I cannot go with you, I'll keep to myself until I find someone who will be glad of my company." When Christian and Hopeful had walked on until they were well ahead of Bunyan, they turned round just in time to see him bowing ostentatiously to three gentlemen who had caught up with him. Their names were Hold the World, Love Money, and Save All, former classmates of Bunyan and ex-pupils of a man called Gripman from the northern country of Coveting. The schoolmaster had instructed his pupils in the art of getting what they wanted by fair means or foul. These three men fell in beside Bunyan and asked him why Christian and Hopeful were walking on ahead. "They want to keep travelling through all weathers and are prepared to lose all they possess on account of their pilgrimage," Bunyan explained. "But I thought that was rather extreme. I like to feel comfortable in my religion." Hold the World wholeheartedly agreed with this latter opinion. "If God gives us good things, he surely wants us to keep them," he reasoned. Then Bunyan posed a question to his companions to help pass the time as they walked along together. If someone had a chance of obtaining the good things of this life and thus bettering himself, would he be justified in doing whatever was necessary in achieving that end, including pretending to be more religious and zealous than he really was, he asked. Love Money replied at once that a person would certainly be justified in assuming an attitude of religious fervour in the cause of financial gain, and the others agreed enthusiastically with this answer. In fact, so certain were these four men that Christian and Hopeful would be of the same opinion that they caught up with them and Hold the World as spokesman repeated Bunyan's question. To this Christian replied incisively, "To follow Christ for gain is wrong. Never in any circumstances, least of all for the sake of self-preferment, could it be right to simulate faith and zeal. Besides, a man who takes up religion for the sake of worldly advantage will doubtless throw it down just as lightly." Hopeful agreed with everything his friend had just said, but the four other men were dumbfounded. Seeing this, Christian and Hopeful turned and walked on. In a few moments, Bunyan and his companion followed, but at a distance. "If they can't take criticism from another man," Christian observed to Hopeful, "how will they cope when they stand before God?" The next stage of their journey took the pilgrims across the narrow plain of ease, at the end of which was a little hill. Beside this stood a man who began to call out as soon as Christian and Hopeful came into view. "Come and see. There's a silver mine over there. Let me show it to you. With a little effort, you could soon be digging up riches for yourself." The The pilgrims stopped to look at the speaker. Hopeful was curious and suggested that they should inspect the mine. But his companion replied warily, "I have heard of this place and of how many people have met their deaths here. Besides, riches are a snare to those who strive for them." Then Christian addressed the stranger, "Isn't the ground near the mine dangerous?" "Not very," was the reply. But the pilgrims noticed that the speaker blushed as he said this. "Let's be on our way," Christian suggested to Hopeful. Overhearing these words, the man again begged the travellers to delay their journey, just long enough to come over and look at the mine. But Christian rounded on him for trying to entice them off the right way, and then said, "Your name is Demas, isn't it?" When the man admitted that it was, Christian exclaimed, "Now I know who you are. Your grandfather was Gehazi, and your father the traitor Judas, and you deserve to be hanged just as he was." Without waiting for Demas's reply, the pilgrims continued on their way. Just before leaving the Plain of Ease, they looked back and saw that Bunyan and his companions were walking towards Demas's mine, which they then entered. To meet what fate the pilgrims could only surmise. Christian and Faithful resumed their journey, but coming across a pillar shaped like a woman, they stopped to read the words above the statue's head. "Remember Lot's wife." This inscription made clear to the pilgrims that the monument had been erected to warn pilgrims against looking back covetously, as Lot's wife had done, and so had been turned into a pillar of salt. The sight made Hopeful feel ashamed of his greedy impulse at the hill of lucre, and grateful that he had been spared the fate of Lot's wife. In this thoughtful frame of mind, he walked along beside Christian. The pilgrims did not have far to go before they arrived at a delightful stretch of countryside, which had been planted and landscaped especially for the benefit of travellers on the way to the celestial city. Their path now lay along one of the banks of the river of the water of life, which was bordered by heavy trees and luscious fruit, bright with healing leaves. Beyond these fertile banks lay lush green meadows, luxuriant with lilies. For several days and nights, Christian and Hopeful remained in this haven, enjoying its delights, finding healing, nourishment, and refreshment. Then they resumed their journey. When the path and the river diverged, the going became difficult, and soon the travellers were footsore and tired. An inviting sight to the left made them pause. This was a attractive by-path meadow. Christian noticed that the path which skirted this meadow seemed to be going in the right direction and promised easier walking conditions. So he suggested they should take it. Hopeful was dubious about the wisdom of this idea, but he allowed himself to be persuaded by Christian's assurance that all would be well, clambered over the stile onto the meadow's path after him. Once there, the pilgrims walked along together. Any doubts Christian might have had about their change of route were resolved when he called out to a fellow traveller not far ahead, "Where does this road lead?" and received the answer, "To the celestial gate." The man in front was called Vain Confidence, and the pilgrims began to follow him. When night fell, they could no longer see to do this. Christian and Hopeful groped their way forward through the dark, but Vain Confidence continued to strive ahead confidently and carelessly. Suddenly he tripped and fell, plunging headlong into a deep pit that lay hidden in his path. The two men behind him heard the shouts, guessing what had happened, stood still, calling out to Vain Confidence as they did so. But a terrible groaning was all the reply they received. "Wherever are we?" Hopeful cried out. But Christian, now very unsure of himself, gave him no answer. The rain began to fall in torrents, while thunder snarled and lightning zigzagged overhead. "How I wish we had not left our way," Hopeful sighed. Christian was wishing the same thing, but he knew that he had taken the wrong path because of him. So now he asked for and was freely granted forgiveness from Hopeful. After that, there was no chance for further conversation as the travellers were fully occupied trying to fight their way back to the King's Highway. But darkness and flooding prevented them from doing so, and only with great difficulty did they avoid being swept away and drowned. Finding at last a shelter of sorts, they threw themselves down under it and fell into an exhausted sleep. Next morning they were roused by a loud, angry voice, which demanded, "Who are you, and what are you doing in my grounds?" Opening their eyes, Christian and Hopeful were confronted by the towering shape of giant Despair. They replied that they were pilgrims who had lost their way. At this stage, the giant bellowed, "You're trespassers on my land, come with me." Then he pushed them over the ground towards the grim stone fortress known as Doubting Castle. There he forced them through the door, down some steps into a stinking dungeon, where he left them. That night he told his wife, Diffidence, about the new captives and asked her what she thought he should do with them. First thing tomorrow, she suggested, make yourself a crabtree cudgel and beat them without mercy. Accordingly, in the morning, the giant entered the dungeon and began to abuse the prisoners, after which he beat them until they were almost senseless. All that day and night, Christian and Hopeful writhed and groaned in agony. At bedtime, the giant again asked his wife what he should do to the prisoners. This time, Diffidence suggested, tell him that their best plan would be to kill themselves. In the morning, the giant visited the dungeon and with brutal bluntness told the prisoners that since they'd never escaped, they should end their lives that very day by stabbing, hanging, or poisoning themselves. Instead of agreeing to this, Christian and Hopeful asked the giant to release them. Their temerity so enraged their captor that his face contorted with hate, and he rushed at the terrified pair. But before reaching them, he became uncontrollably convulsed, as often happened at the onset of one of the fits to which he was subject. This seizure rendered him powerless, saved the prisoners' lives for the moment. After the giant's departure, Christian became so morbidly depressed that he suggested that they might as well obey the giant and put an end to their misery. Hopeful, however, pointed out that killing themselves would be tantamount to committing murder, an act forbidden by their prince. Besides, he added cheerfully, we may yet escape. For I've heard of others who have been the giant's prisoner but have managed to break free by God's grace. That evening, on finding that his captives, though barely breathing, were still alive, the giant flew into one of his terrible rages, after which he left the cell, saying ominously, "You'll soon be wishing you had never been born." For some time, Christian was in a state of stupor. When he was able to speak again, he repeated his suggestion that they should escape their present suffering through suicide. But Hopeful, true to his name, reminded him of all the dangers he had already survived, adding, I, though weaker and younger than you, am enduring the same hardships, so have patience, my brother. That night, when the giant told his wife about the prisoners' irritating refusal to kill themselves, Diffidence put forward another of her unpleasant ideas. Take them to the palace courtyard. Show them the bones and skulls there, she suggested. So in the morning, the giant led the prisoners to the courtyard, forced them to look at the gruesome human remains scattered all over it. These are the bones of former pilgrims killed by me, he told them. Then took them back to their dungeon, pummeling them every step of the way. As on previous nights, when they had gone to bed, giant Despair and Diffidence discussed their captives. He voiced his surprise and annoyance at their continuing survival. But she, with uncanny perception, replied, either they are nursing a secret hope of being rescued, or they have managed to hide a tool with which they mean at the right moment to pick the castle locks and so escape. Promising his wife that the pilgrims would be minutely searched in the morning, the giant fell asleep. Down below in the cell, the prisoners could not sleep, but at midnight they began to pray, and continued in this attitude until dawn, when Christian suddenly exclaimed, "What a fool I have been! All this time I have had the means of escape right here with me." So saying, he put a hand inside his coat, pulled out a bright object. It was a key of promise. "Let's try it now," suggested Hopeful eagerly. With beating hearts, the pilgrims approached the lock of their dungeon and tried the bright key in the lock. It turned easily. The two men pushed the door ajar, stepped out from the den in which they had spent 4 days and 3 sleepless nights without food, water, or light. Then creeping up the stairs and over to the outer door, they tried the key again. Once more it turned smoothly in the lock. The prisoners were able to open the door and slip silently out. Now only one barrier lay between them and freedom: the huge outer gates. They reached these without mishap, but this time the lock did not yield immediately to the key of promise. When at last it did, the pilgrims, forgetting caution, pushed hastily at the iron gates, which began to creak alarmingly. Up in his bedroom, Giant Despair heard the sounds and sprang from his bed. As he moved forward, however, one of his fits seized him, prevented him from going any further. By the time he had recovered, the escaping prisoners had raced towards the meadow, climbing back over the stile, and regained the safety of the King's Highway. Before resuming their journey to the Celestial City, Christian and Hopeful spent some time in building close to the stile a pillar which they hoped would be a warning to future travellers. On this monument they inscribed the words, "Over this stile is the way to Doubting Castle, kept by Giant Despair, who despises the King of the Celestial City and wants to destroy his pilgrims." Then the pilgrims, singing as they walked, headed for the beautiful mountains which Christian had glimpsed from the roof of the Palace Beautiful.